The stadium lights burned like spotlights from heaven, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured field as 8,000 people held their breath in unison. The scoreboard read 21-21 with 12 seconds left on the clock, and the Riverside High Ravens had the ball on the Westfield Warriors' 23-yard line. Coach Martinez paced the sideline like a caged tiger, his weathered hands gripping his headset as he barked into the microphone. But his words were lost in the deafening roar of a crowd that had waited 15 years for this moment. The Friday night lights had never felt heavier, never carried more weight than they did right now. As an entire town's hopes rested on the shoulders of someone who wasn't supposed to be here. Caleb Myers, 18 years old, 5'9", 160 pounds, soaking wet, stood at the 40-yard line, adjusting his borrowed helmet with trembling fingers. The same hands that had been sorting practice jerseys just 3 hours ago. This was the Texas State Championship game, the Golden Grail that had eluded Riverside High since 2008. And somehow, fate had placed the entire season in the hands of a kid who'd never taken a snap, never felt the crush of opposing linemen, never even owned a pair of football cleats until tonight. The roar of the crowd seemed to fade to a distant hum as Caleb's mind raced back through the impossible chain of events that had brought him to this moment. Remembering the countless nights he'd spent alone on this very field, kicking footballs into the darkness while the rest of the world slept. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Son, sometimes life puts you exactly where you're supposed to be, even when you never saw it coming." The referee raised his hand, signaling the timeout was nearly over, and Caleb took a deep breath that tasted like autumn air and possibility. The weight of every Friday night, every practice, every dream that had ever been born under these lights pressed down on his shoulders. But something deep inside him whispered that this moment wasn't an accident. Every late-night kick, every solitary hour spent perfecting his form, every time he'd imagined himself in exactly this situation, while the janitor locked up the school around him, it had all been leading to this. As the teams broke their huddles and jogged toward the line of scrimmage, Caleb Myers, equipment manager turned unlikely hero, prepared to discover whether fairy tales could come true under the Friday night lights of East Texas. Hello my friends. Before we continue our story, leave your like, share the story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Riverside, Texas was the kind of place where everyone knew your name, your family's business, and exactly how many touchdowns your daddy scored back in '92. Population 4,847 souls who lived and breathed by the rhythm of the high school football season. The town square featured a bronze statue of legendary coach Bull Henderson, who'd led the Ravens to 3 state championships in the '70s. And every autumn Friday, the entire downtown would empty out as folks made their pilgrimage to Memorial Stadium. Main Street was lined with businesses that closed early on game days. Martinez Family Auto Repair, where oil changes came with football predictions. Betty's Diner, with its wall of championship photos, and the old Woolworths, that had been converted into a shrine of Ravens memorabilia. This was a place where boys started throwing footballs before they could properly walk, where mothers planned their Friday nights around the concession stand schedule, and where a state championship wasn't just a trophy, it was validation that their small corner of the world mattered. The Myers family had called Riverside home for 3 generations, though they'd never quite fit the typical football family mold that dominated the town's social hierarchy. Jim Myers worked double shifts at the grain elevator on the outskirts of town, his hands permanently stained from years of handling wheat and corn, while his wife Sarah managed the inventory at Henderson Hardware, making sure every farmer and rancher had what they needed to keep their operations running. They lived in a modest 2-bedroom house on Mesquite Street, where the paint was always a year overdue for touching up, and the front porch swing creaked like an old rocking chair whenever the wind picked up from the south. Their son Caleb had inherited his father's quiet determination and his mother's attention to detail. But somehow, the football gene that seemed standard issue for Texas boys had skipped him entirely, leaving him to find his own way in a town that measured success in yards gained and points scored. While his classmates spent their afternoons running wind sprints and hitting blocking sleds, Caleb Myers could usually be found in the equipment room beneath the homeside bleachers, organizing practice jerseys by number and size with the same precision his mother used to arrange hardware inventory. Coach Martinez had initially hired him as a favor to his parents. The team always needed help with the endless logistics of managing gear for 90 players. But Caleb had quickly proven himself indispensable with his knack for knowing exactly where every helmet, shoulder pad, and cleat belonged. He arrived early and stayed late, setting up water stations for practice, collecting dirty uniforms for washing, and making sure the star players' equipment was always cleaned and ready for game day. The coaches appreciated his reliability, the players barely noticed his existence, and Caleb was perfectly content to be part of the machine that made Friday nights possible, even if he'd never experienced the glory himself. But on quiet evenings, when practice had ended and the last player had grabbed his gear and headed home, Caleb would often linger in the empty stadium, drawn by something he couldn't quite name to the field that dominated his town's entire identity. The maintenance crew would be putting away the blocking sleds and collecting stray footballs. And sometimes they'd leave a few behind, forgotten in the end zone or scattered near the goalposts like leather promises waiting to be kept. That's when Caleb discovered his secret. He could kick. Not just kick, he could kick with accuracy that surprised him, with distance that seemed impossible for someone his size, with a natural rhythm that felt as comfortable as breathing. He'd never told anyone about these private sessions, never mentioned to his parents or coaches that he spent his evenings practicing field goals from distances that would make college scouts take notice. The first time he'd attempted a kick, it was purely out of curiosity, a forgotten football sitting on the 30-yard line during a particularly beautiful October sunset, calling to him like an invitation he couldn't refuse. He'd approached it the way he approached everything in his life, methodically, carefully, with the same attention to detail that made him such a valuable equipment manager. The ball had sailed through the uprights with room to spare, and something inside him had awakened, a feeling he'd never experienced before but recognized immediately as his calling. Night after night, he'd return to perfect his craft, teaching himself proper form through YouTube videos and endless repetition, gradually working his way back from 20 yards to 30, then 40, then 50, always alone, always in secret, always wondering if he'd ever have the courage to tell anyone about his hidden talent. By his senior year, Caleb Myers had become as much a part of Riverside Ravens football as the faded paint in the end zone and the rusty goalposts that had witnessed 30 years of dreams and disappointments. He knew every player's jersey size, every coach's preferred brand of athletic tape, and exactly how many towels to have ready for a humid September scrimmage versus a cold November playoff game. The players had long since stopped seeing him as anything more than furniture, reliable, necessary, but invisible. And even his parents assumed his involvement with the team was just a way to feel connected to the social fabric of their football-obsessed town. None of them knew that their quiet, dependable equipment manager had been secretly perfecting a skill that could change everything. Practicing field goals with the dedication of a monk and the precision of a Swiss watchmaker, preparing for an opportunity he never imagined would come. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late November, when the autumn air carried the promise of the state playoffs, and every conversation in Riverside somehow circled back to the Ravens' chances of making a deep run for the first time in over a decade. Sarah Myers was scrambling eggs in the kitchen when the phone rang, and she answered with the distracted tone of someone already running late for work, expecting to hear Betty from the diner asking about their weekend plans, or maybe Mrs. Henderson, wondering if they needed any extra volunteers for the playoff concession stand. Instead, Coach Martinez's distinctive gravelly voice filled the kitchen, asking if he could speak with Caleb about a special opportunity that had presented itself. And the serious tone in his voice made Sarah's hand freeze halfway to turning off the burner. Caleb had been gathering his backpack and equipment manager duties checklist, preparing for another routine day of inventory and preparation, But when his mother handed him the phone with raised eyebrows, he knew immediately that something had shifted in the carefully ordered universe of his high school existence. Coach Martinez explained the situation with a kind of measured urgency that came from 25 years of managing teenage athletes and their families. Tommy Rodriguez, their all-district kicker, who'd been automatic from 40 yards and closer all season, had torn his ACL during Monday's practice while attempting to tackle a returner during punt coverage drills. The injury meant surgery, months of rehabilitation, and the immediate end of his senior season, just as the Ravens were preparing for their first playoff run since Caleb had been in middle school. "Son, I've watched you around this program for 4 years," Coach Martinez said, his voice carrying the weight of someone about to change a young man's life forever. "You know football better than most of these boys who've been playing since they were 7 years old, and I've got a feeling there's more to you than meets the eye." The coach paused, letting the implication hang in the air like morning fog over the Brazos River. "I want you to try out for the kicker position." The silence that followed felt like it lasted for hours, though the kitchen clock indicated only 30 seconds had passed while Caleb's world tilted on its axis and rearranged itself into possibilities he'd never dared to imagine. His mother stood frozen at the stove, eggs growing cold on her plate, while his father appeared in the doorway with his coffee mug suspended halfway to his lips. Both parents reading their son's face for clues about what could possibly require such urgent attention from the head coach. Caleb's mind raced through a dozen different responses. From the practical coach, "I've never even been to a real practice, to be honest. I've been secretly kicking field goals for 2 years, and dreaming about this exact moment," to the terrified, "What if I fail in front of the entire town?" What came out instead was a simple "Yes, sir," delivered with the same quiet confidence he'd used to organize equipment rooms and manage game day logistics. Though his heart was hammering against his ribs like a woodpecker attacking an old oak tree. The tryout was scheduled for that afternoon, immediately after regular practice, and word spread through Riverside High with the speed of gossip in a small town where everybody knew everybody's business by lunchtime. Players whispered in the hallways about the equipment manager who thought he could kick. Teachers speculated in the faculty lounge about Coach Martinez's desperation, and students gathered around lockers to debate whether Caleb Myers had lost his mind or found his calling. By the time the final bell rang, half the student body had made plans to stick around and witness what would either be the most inspiring moment in recent Ravens history or the most embarrassing spectacle since the homecoming dance of 2019, when Tommy Brewster had attempted to ask out the homecoming queen via singing telegram. Caleb spent his last 2 class periods trying to focus on calculus and American history while his stomach performed gymnastics routines that would have impressed Olympic judges. When practice ended and the regular players jogged to the locker room, Caleb found himself standing alone on the 50-yard line with Coach Martinez, offensive coordinator Coach Thompson, and about 40 curious spectators scattered through the bleachers like witnesses to a miracle or a disaster. Depending on your perspective, the coaches had set up a simple test: kicks from 20, 30, and 40 yards, 5 attempts from each distance, with the understanding that consistency mattered more than raw power in the high-pressure situations they'd face. In the playoffs, Coach Martinez handed him a pair of kicking cleats that had belonged to Tommy Rodriguez, size 11 instead of his usual size 9, and clapped him on the shoulder with the kind of paternal encouragement that coaches reserved for moments when they were either about to discover a diamond in the rough or watch a young man learn a hard lesson about overreach. "Just kick it like you know how, son," he said, though he had no idea that Caleb had been practicing this exact scenario in his mind for nearly 2 years. The first kick from 20 yards sailed through the uprights with room to spare, drawing a murmur of surprised appreciation from the small crowd and a raised eyebrow from Coach Thompson, who'd been expecting a disaster. The second kick split the uprights perfectly, followed by 3 more that could have been launched by a machine for their consistency and accuracy. From 30 yards, Caleb connected on 4 out of 5 attempts, missing the second kick by inches to the right, but immediately correcting his form for the remaining 3. By the time they moved back to 40 yards, the murmurs from the bleachers had turned to genuine excitement. And even some of the varsity players had emerged from the locker room to watch the equipment manager, who was quietly rewriting their assumptions about what was possible. The final 5 kicks from 40 yards told the story: 3 perfect spirals through the center of the goalposts. One that scraped the right upright, but still counted. And one that sailed wide left as Caleb's nerves finally caught up with the magnitude of what was happening. As the sun set behind the home side bleachers, and the small crowd began to disperse, Coach Martinez approached Caleb with the kind of smile that coaches wore when they'd just discovered something special. Something that could change the trajectory of an entire season. "Son," he said, extending his hand for a firm shake that felt like a contract being signed, "welcome to the varsity team. Practice starts tomorrow at 3:30 sharp. And you better bring your appetite for hard work, because we've got 3 weeks to get you ready for the biggest games of your life." The words hung in the cooling air like a promise and a challenge, while Caleb Myers, former equipment manager, current kicker, future hero, or heartbreak, nodded his acceptance of a destiny he'd been secretly preparing for longer than anyone could possibly imagine. The transition from invisible equipment manager to split-like carrying varsity player felt like jumping from a rowboat onto a speeding freight train, complete with the bruises, confusion, and occasional moments of pure terror that came with trying to find your footing while everything around you moved at breakneck speed. Caleb's first official practice as the Ravens kicker began at 3:30 sharp on a Wednesday afternoon that felt more like a trial by fire than an introduction to team dynamics, with 90 sets of eyes watching his every move as he attempted to prove that his tryout performance hadn't been a fluke. The veteran players, many of whom had barely acknowledged his existence during 4 years of equipment management, suddenly found themselves dependent on the quiet kid who'd been washing their jerseys and organizing their gear, a role reversal that created an awkward tension thick enough to cut with a machete. Coach Martinez had made it clear that Caleb would be expected to master not just field goals and extra points, but also kickoffs, onside kicks, and the dozens of special situations that could arise during a playoff run, essentially cramming for years of specialized training into 3 weeks of preparation. The academic pressure that came with being a varsity athlete hit Caleb like a linebacker blindsiding a quarterback, as teachers who'd previously seen him as a reliable B+ student suddenly expected him to maintain his grades while missing classes for team meetings, film sessions, and the inevitable media attention that followed high school football in Texas. Mrs. Patterson, his advanced placement English teacher, pulled him aside after class to express her concerns about his ability to complete his senior thesis while juggling the demands of playoff football, her worried tone suggesting she'd seen too many promising students derailed by athletic pursuits. The guidance counselor, Mr. Williams, scheduled an emergency meeting to discuss how his new football responsibilities might affect his college applications, particularly his planned major in mechanical engineering at Texas A&M, which had accepted him based on his academic record rather than any athletic achievements. The weight of maintaining his 3.8 GPA while learning an entirely new position felt like trying to solve calculus problems while riding a mechanical bull. The social dynamics of high school shifted around Caleb like tectonic plates rearranging themselves after an earthquake, as students who'd never spoken to him suddenly wanted to be his best friend, while others whispered behind his back about favoritism and desperation moves by the coaching staff. Jessica Walsh, who'd been his lab partner in chemistry for the entire semester, suddenly started asking if he wanted to study together for the upcoming exam, her newfound interest coinciding suspiciously with his elevation to varsity status. Meanwhile, Derek Harrison, the starting linebacker who'd never so much as nodded in his direction, began making pointed comments about real players versus equipment boys playing dress-up. Comments that stung all the more because they contained just enough truth to burrow under Caleb's skin like splinters. The cafeteria became a minefield of social navigation as he tried to figure out where he belonged in the complex hierarchy of high school athletics. No longer invisible, but not yet fully accepted. The physical demands of special teams practice, pushed Caleb's body beyond anything he'd experienced during his solitary training sessions. As Coach Thompson introduced him to the brutal reality of kicking under pressure while 250-pound linemen charged toward him with bad intentions, his first attempted field goal during a scrimmage against the scout team ended with him flat on his back. Courtesy of a delayed rush that taught him the difference between kicking alone in an empty stadium and kicking while angry teenagers tried to separate his head from his shoulders. The bruises on his ribs and the grass stains on his practice jersey served as daily reminders that football was a contact sport, even for kickers who were supposed to be protected by unwritten rules and referee vigilance. His legs, accustomed to the controlled environment of solo practice, began cramping during longer sessions, and his right ankle developed a persistent ache that he refused to mention to the trainers for fear of being labeled injury-prone before he'd even played a real game. The mental pressure proved even more challenging than the physical demands, as every practice kick was scrutinized by coaches who were betting their season on an untested player, teammates who needed him to be reliable under pressure, and the ever-present knowledge that the entire town's championship dreams rested on his ability to perform when it mattered most. Sports psychologist sessions with Mrs. Rodriguez, the team's mental performance coach, introduced him to visualization techniques and breathing exercises designed to manage anxiety. But nothing could fully prepare him for the crushing weight of expectation that followed him home each night. His parents tried to be supportive, attending practices and offering encouragement, but he could see the worry in their eyes as they watched their academically focused son navigate the brutal world of Texas high school football politics. Sleep became elusive, replaced by nights spent staring at the ceiling and replaying missed kicks or imagining worst-case scenarios, where his failure cost the team their championship hopes. The breaking point came during a particularly brutal practice, 2 weeks before the first playoff game, when Caleb missed 3 consecutive field goals from 35 yards, a distance he'd been automatic from during his secret training sessions. While the entire team watched in mounting frustration, Coach Martinez called him over after practice, his weathered face showing the strain of a coach who'd gambled everything on an unproven player and was beginning to wonder if he'd made a catastrophic mistake. "Son, I've got faith in you, but faith doesn't win football games," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 25 years of coaching experience and the dreams of an entire community. "You've got talent, but talent without mental toughness is just a pretty statistic in a losing game." The words hit harder than any physical contact he'd experienced, forcing Caleb to confront the possibility that his fairy tale transformation from equipment manager to hero might end in disaster, with his failure becoming the story that haunted Riverside football for decades to come. That night, alone in his bedroom with homework abandoned and college applications forgotten, Caleb Myers faced the darkest moment of his unlikely journey, wondering if he'd been foolish to believe that secret practice sessions and natural talent could overcome the gulf between dreaming about glory and actually achieving it under the unforgiving lights of Texas playoff football. The revelation came not during a dramatic team meeting or an inspirational coach's speech, but on a quiet Thursday evening when Caleb found himself alone in Memorial Stadium, holding a worn football and confronting the demons that had been stalking him since his catastrophic practice performance 2 days earlier. The sun was setting behind the visiting team bleachers, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with this place during all those solitary practice sessions. And for the first time in weeks, the stadium felt like sanctuary rather than judgment. He'd come here not to practice his technique or work on his mechanics, but simply to remember who he was before the pressure and expectations had clouded his vision like fog rolling in from the Gulf Coast. As he stood on the 30-yard line, the same spot where he'd missed those 3 consecutive kicks that had shaken everyone's confidence, Caleb realized that he'd been trying so hard to become someone else, the clutch performer, the unlikely hero, the savior of Riverside football, that he'd forgotten the quiet determination and methodical approach that had made him successful in the first place. The breakthrough moment arrived when old Mr. Henderson, the school's longtime custodian and grandfather of the legendary coach whose statue stood in the town square, emerged from the equipment building with his usual Thursday evening routine of checking the stadium lights and securing the facility for the night. Instead of shooing Caleb away or questioning his presence, the elderly man approached with the kind of unhurried wisdom that came from 50 years of watching young men struggle with the weight of their own potential. "Son, I've been cleaning up after football players since before your daddy was born," he said, settling onto the bench with a grunt that spoke of arthritis and decades of physical labor. "Seen plenty of boys with all the talent in the world who couldn't handle the pressure, and seen others with half the ability who found ways to succeed because they understood something most folks never figure out." He paused to point toward the faded championship banners hanging from the press box, each one representing a team that had found a way to overcome impossible odds through collective effort and individual courage. Mr. Henderson's stories of past Ravens teams revealed a pattern that Caleb had never considered. Every championship squad had featured unlikely heroes who'd stepped up when their moment arrived. Players who weren't necessarily the most talented but who understood their role and executed it with unwavering consistency when everything was on the line. That 78 team that won it all had a quarterback who couldn't throw the ball 30 yards, but he never threw an interception when it mattered, the old custodian recalled, his eyes twinkling with memories of Friday nights when the entire town had believed in magic. The 82 squad had a running back who ran a 5.2 40-yard dash, but he never fumbled in 4 years of varsity football. The lesson became clear as Mr. Henderson continued. Greatness wasn't about being perfect or spectacular, but about being reliable when your team needed you most. About understanding that your job was to do your part so that others could do theirs. The community support that had always existed but never been fully visible to Caleb began revealing itself in ways that surprised and humbled him, starting with his parents' decision to take vacation days from work so they could attend every remaining practice and offer their quiet encouragement from the bleachers. His father, who'd never played organized sports but understood the value of craftsmanship and precision, began offering insights about the mechanics of kicking that helped Caleb refine his approach with the same attention to detail he'd always applied to equipment management. His mother, meanwhile, had been secretly building a network of support among other team parents, organizing meal trains for playoff weeks and coordinating travel arrangements for families who wanted to follow the team on their championship run. The town itself seemed to rally around the story of the equipment manager turned kicker, with business owners displaying Kick M Caleb signs in their windows and the local newspaper running a feature story about his journey that made him realize how many people were invested in his success. The relationship between Caleb and Coach Martinez deepened during a series of one-on-one conversations that revealed the coach's own unlikely path to Riverside High, including his years as a backup player in college, who'd learned to contribute through special teams, and his early coaching career at schools where resources were scarce and creativity was essential for success. "Son, I didn't put you on this team because I was desperate," Coach Martinez confided during a film session where they analyzed successful kickers from college and professional levels. "I put you on this team because I recognized something in you that reminded me of myself at your age, the hunger to prove that being overlooked doesn't mean being without value." The coach shared his philosophy that football teams were built not just on star players but on role players who understood their importance to the larger mission, and that the best teams were those where every member trusted every other member to do their job when the stakes were highest. The new approach to his kicking routine emerged organically from these conversations and revelations, as Caleb began incorporating the same methodical preparation that had made him an exceptional equipment manager into his game day mental routine. Instead of trying to kick like the college players he'd watched on YouTube, he developed his own pre-kick ritual that included specific visualization techniques, breathing patterns, and physical movements that helped him recreate the calm focus he'd experienced during those solitary practice sessions. He stopped worrying about impressing his teammates or living up to external expectations, and instead focused on the simple goal of executing his technique with the same precision he'd used to organize equipment rooms or manage inventory spreadsheets. The kicks began finding their mark again, not because he'd suddenly become more talented, but because he'd remembered how to be himself under pressure. The final piece of his transformation came during a scrimmage against Westfield High, their likely first-round playoff opponent. When Coach Martinez called for a field goal attempt from 42 yards, with the score tied and 2 minutes remaining on the clock, as Caleb lined up behind holder Jake Morrison, the senior quarterback who'd welcomed him to the team with genuine warmth, he felt the familiar calm that had always preceded his best kicks during those secret practice sessions. The snap was perfect, the hold was clean, and the kick sailed through the uprights with room to spare. But more importantly, Caleb felt like himself again, not the reluctant hero or the unlikely savior, but simply the kid who'd found his calling under the Friday night lights and was ready to see where that calling would take him. The Texas Class 4A Division II state championship game between the Riverside Ravens and the Westfield Warriors kicked off under a canopy of stars that seemed brighter than usual, as if the entire universe had gathered to witness what would become the most talked about high school football game in East Texas history. Memorial Stadium had been transformed into a carnival of hope and anxiety, with both sides of the field packed beyond capacity as fans who'd driven hundreds of miles clutched their lucky charms and tried to manage expectations that had been building for 15 years of near misses and heartbreak. The air carried the scent of stadium nachos, autumn leaves, and the kind of nervous energy that crackled like electricity before a thunderstorm, while the halftime show from both marching bands created a soundtrack of dreams and desperation that echoed off the metal bleachers. Caleb Myers, wearing number 12, instead of his usual equipment manager polo shirt, stood on the sideline with his helmet tucked under his arm, watching the pre-game warm-ups and trying to process the surreal reality that he was about to play in the biggest game of his life. The game itself unfolded like a heavyweight boxing match between two fighters who'd trained their entire lives for this moment, with both teams trading blows and momentum shifts that kept the crowd on their feet and coaches pacing the sidelines like caged animals, sensing opportunity and danger in equal measure. Westfield struck first with a methodical 12-play drive that showcased their experienced offensive line and all-state running back Marcus Johnson, who'd committed to the University of Texas and looked every bit the part as he punished Ravens defenders for 83 yards and a touchdown. Riverside answered immediately with a perfectly executed flea flicker that caught the Warriors' defense napping, as quarterback Jake Morrison tossed a lateral to running back David Chen, who flipped the ball back to Morrison for a 40-yard touchdown pass to receiver Tommy Valdez, the son of the local fire chief, who'd been dreaming of this moment since he started catching passes from his father in their backyard. The first quarter ended with Westfield leading 14-7. But both teams had served notice that this would be a game worthy of the stage. The second and third quarters became a masterclass in playoff football intensity, with every snap carrying the weight of childhood dreams and adult expectations, as players on both sides elevated their performance to levels that would be remembered long after the final whistle. Riverside's defense, led by senior captain Marcus Williams, began solving Westfield's ground game with a series of adjustments that showcased for years of studying film and perfecting technique under Coach Thompson's demanding system. The Ravens' offense, meanwhile, found success through a balanced attack that kept the Warriors' defense guessing, with Morrison distributing the ball to 7 different receivers and Chen grinding out tough yards between the tackles like a player possessed by the spirit of every running back who'd ever worn the black and gold. By the end of the third quarter, the scoreboard read 21-21, and everyone in the stadium understood they were witnessing something special. A game that would join the pantheon of legendary championship contests that old-timers would discuss for decades to come. The fourth quarter belonged to destiny and heartbreak in equal measure, as both teams made the kind of plays that separate champions from all-arounds, with individual performances that transcended the boundaries between high school athletics and pure sporting artistry. Westfield regained the lead with 8:47 remaining when their senior quarterback, David Martinez, no relation to Coach Martinez, threw a perfect strike to his favorite target in the corner of the end zone. A play they'd practiced thousands of times and executed with surgical precision when it mattered most. Riverside answered with their own slice of perfection, a grinding drive that consumed 6 minutes of clock and culminated in a 1-yard touchdown run by Chen, who'd been nursing a sprained ankle for 3 weeks but refused to let injury derail his team's championship dreams. The extra point sailed through the uprights, courtesy of Caleb's steady leg, tying the game at 28-28 with 2:47 remaining, and setting up the dramatic conclusion that would define both teams' legacies. Westfield's final drive began with the methodical precision of a team that had been in pressure situations all season. As they moved the ball efficiently through short passes and runs that ate clock, while putting them in position to score the winning touchdown. But Riverside's defense, playing with the desperation of a team that understood this might be their last chance at glory, stiffened in the red zone and forced a field goal attempt with 12 seconds remaining. The Warriors kicker, who'd been perfect all season from inside 40 yards, pushed his attempt wide right, sending a collective gasp through the Westfield side of the stadium, and hope surging through the Ravens faithful like electricity through a lightning rod. Riverside took possession at their own 27-yard line with 12 seconds and no timeouts, needing to move the ball 30 yards to give their kicker a reasonable chance at a game-winning field goal, a scenario that seemed impossible, until Morrison took the snap and launched a perfect spiral toward the Westfield 30-yard line. Time seemed suspended like a photograph as the football spiraled through the night air, carrying the hopes of an entire town and the dreams of players who'd given everything they had to reach this moment. While Caleb Myers watched from the sideline and felt his heart hammering against his ribs like a woodpecker attacking an oak tree, the pass found receiver Alex Santos in stride at the 23-yard line, where he was immediately tackled as the clock showed zeros across the board. But the referee's whistle had blown with 1 second remaining, setting up the most dramatic moment in Riverside High School football history. Coach Martinez called his final timeout and jogged onto the field to meet Caleb at the 40-yard line, his weathered face showing the strain of a coach who'd bet everything on an equipment manager turned kicker and was about to discover whether faith and preparation could overcome the longest odds in Texas high school football. "Son, this is what we've been preparing for," he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. 40-yard field goal to win the state championship. Just kick it like you know how. The immediate aftermath of Caleb's 40-yard field goal, which split the uprights with room to spare and triggered a celebration that could be heard 3 counties away, felt like watching a movie about someone else's life. As players tackled him in the end zone, while coaches hugged and grown men wept openly in the stands. The Riverside Ravens had won their first state championship since 1982, and the town square statue of Coach Bull Henderson now had company in the form of dozens of fans who wanted to touch the helmet of the equipment manager who'd become a legend in the span of 3 weeks. Local newspaper photographer Martha Stevens captured the moment that would grace the front page of newspapers across East Texas. Caleb Myers, still wearing his oversized jersey and grass-stained pants, being carried off the field by teammates who'd gone from barely acknowledging his existence to treating him like the hero he'd always secretly imagined himself becoming. The celebration lasted until dawn, with cars honking throughout downtown Riverside and impromptu parties breaking out in front yards where championship banners had been stored in closets for decades, waiting for this moment. The long-term impact of that kick rippled through Caleb's life in ways he never could have anticipated, beginning with college scholarship offers from schools that had never heard his name before the championship game, but suddenly saw potential in the steady-legged kicker who'd delivered under the ultimate pressure. Texas A&M, where he'd planned to study mechanical engineering as a regular student, offered him a partial scholarship to continue his academic career while contributing to their special teams unit, an opportunity that would allow his parents to breathe easier financially while their son pursued his dreams at the next level. More importantly, The confidence he'd gained from succeeding when everything was on the line began manifesting in other areas of his life. As he approached college applications, scholarship interviews, and even relationships with the same methodical preparation and quiet confidence that had made him successful under the Friday night lights. His parents, who'd worried about their shy son finding his place in the world, watched with pride as he developed leadership skills and self-assurance that would serve him long after his kicking days were over. The lessons learned. During his transformation, from invisible equipment manager to championship hero, became the foundation for how Caleb approached every challenge that followed. Whether in college classrooms, internship interviews, or the eventual career in aerospace engineering that combined his love of precision with his appreciation for teamwork and preparation, he discovered that the same attention to detail that had made him an exceptional equipment manager and reliable kicker also made him successful in complex engineering projects, where small mistakes could have catastrophic consequences, and success depended on every team member understanding their role and executing it flawlessly. The mental toughness he'd developed while learning to kick under pressure served him well during difficult exams, challenging work assignments, and the inevitable setbacks that every ambitious person encounters on their path to success. Years later, when speaking to high school students about pursuing their dreams, he would always emphasize that preparation meets opportunity in the most unexpected ways, and that the skills you develop in seemingly unimportant roles often become the foundation for extraordinary achievements. The transformation of Caleb Myers from equipment manager to state championship hero became more than just a personal success story. It evolved into a symbol of hope for an entire community that had learned to believe in the power of perseverance and the magic that could happen when someone was willing to step up when their moment arrived. His jersey number 12 was retired at halftime of the following season's homecoming game, joining the handful of legendary Ravens whose contributions had transcended individual statistics to become part of the school's permanent legacy. But perhaps more meaningfully, his story inspired a generation of students who'd been overlooked, underestimated, or relegated to supporting roles to understand that greatness could emerge from the most unlikely places when preparation met opportunity. Under the bright lights of possibility, the equipment room where he'd spent 4 years organizing gear now featured a plaque commemorating his journey, reminding future managers that their contributions to the team extended far beyond washing jerseys and counting helmets. As Caleb Myers walked across the graduation stage 3 months later, accepting his diploma with the same quiet confidence he'd displayed while lining up for the most important kick in Riverside High School history, he carried with him the knowledge that fairy tales could indeed come true under the Friday night lights of East Texas, not through magic or luck, but through the powerful combination of hidden preparation, unwavering dedication, and the courage to seize the moment when destiny came calling. The boy who'd started as an invisible equipment manager had become a young man who understood that everyone has their moment to shine, and that the greatest victories often belong to those who spent years getting ready for an opportunity they never saw coming. In the end, Caleb's story wasn't just about a kick that won a championship. It was about discovering that sometimes the most extraordinary journeys begin in the most ordinary places, and that the quiet kid organizing equipment in the shadows might just be the hero your team has been waiting for all along.